Good evening, everyone. So I would like to propose this motion that this House regrets the rise of radical secular states. And I'd like to emphasize that we're talking about radical states. Because in general, I would say that church-state is actually a good thing, that it'll lead to less assumptions, less intolerance, less undemocratic, old-fashioned laws and stereotypes. But that when it becomes radical, it then undoes all this good work, that it then becomes intolerant. It starts to deny religions, because to be a radical secular state, you have to start banning religions. So I have 2 points on why this is a bad thing. The first one is that religion is actually, on balance, I would say a good thing. And the second is that being overly secular, the second point is that being overly secular is bad because it bans freedom of expression, because it stops people from understanding each other. So, okay, first off, religion is a good thing. I don't know about you, but I really like Christmas. I love getting presents. I love putting up decorations. I love going to mass and hearing choirs. Like, there is a whole culture around religion that we can all take part in. And, okay, maybe for people who don't believe in it, they won't enjoy it as much, but they can still opt into it. They can opt into their other religions. They can opt into secular holidays, but they're just not as fun. Religion is a good thing. Religion, when someone dies, to have that comfort of a ritual, to know what to do next, those steps are really, they're really beneficial for people. To have religious values like education and charity, religion and education in Ireland are so intertwined. And to have religions like Islam, to have people telling you, donate 2.5% of your income every year because that is what God wants. Yes?
Can you give me a single example of a radical secular state which has banned a religion?
I would argue that France is becoming a radical items, like you can't wear the burqa, you can't wear crosses, that you can't express religion in the public sphere. That is radical secularism. So, okay, you could argue that some of these you could have without religion, but I disagree. I think that without an institution like the church to back up and fund and organize and have a collective, your culture is much harder to create. If you have, no thank you, if you have artists who don't have a church funding them, it is much harder for them as individuals to achieve their goals. And the state is not going to fund this thing because the state tends to be more kind of practical. They're not as interested in culture as religion is. So religion can be hugely beneficial. Another way that religion is really beneficial is that it practices what it preaches. For every action you have in religion, there's a message behind it. You shake hands as a sign of peace. You wear a wedding ring to remind yourself of eternal love. Religion has something secularism doesn't, in that it tries to get you to mix belief and action. It repeats itself to you. Every year you have Christmas, every year you have Easter, every year, every year you have these messages, every week you have these messages in your mosque being repeated and taught to you. That is something that secularism doesn't have. We in college, I don't know about you, but I don't remember a thing that is said in my lecture. It is said once and move on. You have to have repetition, and religion does this. Yes?
If I am going to die and there will be nothing after that, why should I spend my life giving meaning to religions that have no benefit to me rather than to my life in itself?
I would argue that it does have benefits. For example, the Tao, you have things like that sense of collective engagement and belonging to something greater. That can give you purpose. And I would argue that you don't know that there is nothing after you die. I would rather be the optimist who says, maybe I will live after I die, than assuming the worst, Ollie. Okay, so I would argue that in a radical state, you can't have this religion being taught, which is negative not only because it denies you the benefits I've just outlined, but also because it stops you from understanding other cultures. We in the West, we are more secular, and we think that people who join ISIS are, they're just crazies. That is really dangerous, to say that someone is just, insane if they join ISIS, insane if they join a nunnery, insane if they live through this religious belief. Because you're not actually understanding their culture, you're dismissing it, because you've never studied it, because religion hasn't been taught in this radical state that doesn't like to mention religion. And you also can't, no thank you, you also can't talk about your past. You can't identify with, say, medieval churches and the architecture. You will, if you have never experienced religion in the public sphere, it's very unlikely that you will be able to understand past cultures, to understand how Ireland could have banned contraception, how your own history and how others' history, you can't relate to people unless you have at some stage been taught about religion. You can't understand the art. You miss out on so many of those cool Bible stories. You don't get to hear about floods and deserts and plagues. Like, these are they're really engaging. And to say that you can't have these in the public sphere is trying to ban them. It is trying to stop people from keeping alive these traditions. It actually is denying yourself from enjoying something. Okay, so next point, freedom of expression. You may say, as Ollie has implied, that like an opinion on God is just an opinion. There's actually nothing afterwards. But you can't prove that. And if we are allowing people to deny things that can't be proven, that's a really bad precedent, because it's saying if we don't like an idea, we just won't listen to it. And if you're not listening to it, you're not actually questioning it. You're not actually disproving it. You're stopping yourself from thinking. And I would argue that that in itself is just a terrible thing to start. Instead, you are silencing opposition. You are pretending that silence is agreement. And we are constantly being told nowadays consent and silence are two very separate things. So a radical secular state is actually going to lead to intolerance. We've seen this in France. We've seen people being forced to undress at gunpoint because they are deemed to be religious. They have to remove these burkinis. They are not allowed to wear crosses in schools. You are not allowed to express any religion, say in communism. When there is full communism on a full scale, you have churches being destroyed. People cannot then just have religion as a private part of themselves. That doesn't work, because you were being told that what you believe, what you honestly think is God's will, what you honestly think is part of your identity is not good enough for the public, that there is something dirty about religion, and there is absolutely not. It's instead of being persecuted by other religions, you are now being persecuted by the state. It is now, the state becomes the oppressive religion in those societies, because you are being forced to hide your different views. You are not being taught about tolerance. Instead, you are being taught about fear. You are being forced to choose between two identities. You are being alienated, and this will just cause anti-state feeling. You need to have a balance between religion and state. They can be separate, but they should both be acknowledged. Thank you very much.
I couldn't help but think now as I was listening to Eunice's very excellent speech, that there's a very interesting point near the end about, this is following from Ollie's, a very important question. She said to Ollie, you can't prove he doesn't exist, to which I naturally thought, you can't prove he exists. But Barr stating the obvious, and another issue was that not teaching religion is closed-minded, and generally speaking, most theocratic states in history have equally not been known for freedom of expression. So it's a bit ironic, to say the least, to say that a secular state would be worse. And I suppose now this was actually onto my own thing. I think now for most people here, you're probably wondering, what is a radical secular state? I was wondering and I've been speaking on this, so that was probably not the best of starts. But I'm going to argue that any secular state, by the very nature of their existence, is in fact a radical invention. And the reason I believe that is that out of the 5,000 years of human recorded history, the secular state has only been around for the past 200 years. That means there's over 5,000 years in which the standard political norm has been a religious theme state. If you go back 1700, actually, yes.
Well, I mean, there are countries like China which actually have religion, so I think there is a spectrum of radicalness within secular states.
That's true. But see, the thing is now, I'm arguing that being secular in itself is in fact a radical invention, and I was going to continue here. Every regime, until the French Revolution and the American Revolution, had inherently focused on religious aspects. Before, you had the ancient regime France, you had the Reformation periods, you had wars of religion, you had medieval Europe, you had the Abbasidic Caliphates, you had there was the Roman Republic, which is religious themed. You had temple complex city-states in ancient Mesopotamia like Uruk and Nippur. This is a strong tradition, and the very fact that we have states to this day, not all states, I may say, there are plenty of states these days. The UK is a state monarchy, is an established monarchy, as is Scandinavian countries. But this is the first time in relative human history that we have states that are secular, and that itself is a very radical innovation. Now, to actually go on to this point, now why I think that we shouldn't oppose this? Well, I think if you oppose the rise of this kind of thing, well, what's the alternative to a secular state, these rise of these states? What is the alternative? And if you don't, what came before this? And this is when take France actually. Take France in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, when we actually had states that were not secular. They were outwardly Christian. The French king was the most Christian king. If you were not Catholic, you were expelled from the country. People could be arrested for their religion. People were often executed or banished. There was witch burnings all across Europe. And in regards to fun Bible stories, you're actually allowed to burn people as witches, which is nice as a story, but it's very unfortunate when it becomes an apparatus of state policy. Yes.
Have communist and completely secular societies not also persecuted people who are religious?
Oh yes, I don't deny that, and that is quite true. But the point is, in that thing, that wasn't because my God's better than your God's. That was in the further of an ideology, which religion itself is. So I don't think that's a major issue, really. Now, in principle, the secular state as an idea should not hate religions. It just refuses to favor one religion over another. And there is variety in that, but that is the principle that should be aimed for, the ideal. It should be foster pluralism. The American Constitution does not favor any religion. They avowedly try to avoid that because they did not want to promote religious dissension. And dissension is inherently a bad thing for any states. Any state that's had any religious conflicts, from Northern Ireland to anywhere currently in the Middle East between Sunni and Shia, will know that religious dissension is a bad thing. Now, currently, actually, in reference to France, the bikini bans, what we see in France at the moment is not the function of a secular state, but what we see is racism. That is a racism to people who the French are not seeing as French. That is Christian-fueled racism. And for all the pronunciations about, that it's against the French attitude, I have not seen any nuns being forced to take off their habits. A mayor of Nice in June said said nuns could not do it, but that nothing was ever done. It's all nice and good in theory, but if they're not actually enforcing that, it's only being targeted quite explicitly at one particular faith, Islam. And I would argue that is more sectarian racism, if anything else, rather than a function of secularism. Go ahead, Stephen.
So why is it better to apply targets on religions in general as a general trend? Even yes, it happens in 1 to 2 instances in places like France. But why is that why because it happens to one group should we do that for all groups be an actual argument instead of an actual tolerance for all groups?
I'm not arguing for banning all religion, I'm arguing for tolerance of religion. I am arguing that we should have states that do not have a theocratic element as there has. That is the argument. I am not saying that we should ban all religions. What I am saying is we should have states, unlike this republic, unlike many other states across the world, both now and in the past, where God or any religion should not be the focus. It should not be the thing that we unite ourselves around. There should be different things that we do this. And this was on, I suppose, to my second point. Now, why I think we should oppose this motion. And I generally believe that a secular state, this idea, it's an improvement over regimes. And this is from my own personal experience from being from Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, since its inception in the 1920s, has been a Protestant country, much like how the first the Irish Free State and later the Irish Republic was by its inception a Catholic country. Now, I can't obviously speak as much on the Republic, but I can see about the North, that it was a sectarian bigoted state. There's nothing, you can't deny that. The Troubles were sparked off in part by the fact that Catholics had to march for their civil rights, the Nicene movement. You can't deny that religious turmoil was an inherently dangerous and sad part of the history of this island, both Northern Ireland especially. I think to want a more secular regime for places like Northern Ireland is not a bad thing. To actually want for our country not to be divided into 2 religious lines. In Northern Ireland, yes, it's Catholicism and Protestantism. In places in the Middle East, of course, in Islam, it's currently Sunni and Shiaism. These are things that we want to avoid. And I think not to want that is to repeat the mistakes of the past. We should look forwards. We should look forwards and really think about how we can make a more secular society in which people do not hate each other, are not grown to mistrust someone else because they don't buy into the to this national religious image story. And I do think that if you do regret the rise of secular states, which by their very definition are a radical thing, you are implicitly, if not explicitly, you are implicitly suggesting the return of more theocratic centered states, and for this reason I beg you to oppose this motion.
working?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to oppose this motion. Thank you, Connor, for noting there are a few speeches left. I feel like a few sentences are enough to take down your entire speech, so we'll see. Right, so, yeah. I feel like we need to start by giving a definition of secularism in this debate, just because I'm pedant and it's something we need to do. Right, so if we're operating on the belief that secularism, in this case, as we're talking about states, is the belief that religion should not be part of the affairs of state or public education, it is incredibly vital, we think, on opposition, that erasing the view of state on any culture in the spheres of governance, legislature, and democratic policy is the most powerful agency you can give a state to espouse true parity. It's what would have allowed things like gay marriage, parity for groups, who exist in the Venn diagram of potentially being religious or not, but who also exist, as people with other personalities, other parts of their character, such as, being gay, being of a different gender, being in any sort of minority group that's exclusive to religion. It's what gives government the power it needs to carry out change for them far quicker than if they had to pander to the religion of the majority, and also to be seen to be pandering to the religions of minority without giving them any real agency or ability to effect change in that state. And so ultimately we think actually on this side it's a lot easier on migrants, refugees, etc. When the state doesn't intervene in your religious choice, a lot of my speech is actually going to be based on Eunice's idea of, religion gives the state a routine. Religion gives me a kind of, holiday routine that I can observe, a certain thing that I have to do all the time. It's a lot easier on migrants, refugees, and other minority groups when the state doesn't intervene in your religious choice or that of anyone else's, which you're very free to practice in a private space. Yeah, people bow to Mecca, people go to noon prayer. They usually do that in a room in a building where they feel safe to do so. The state doesn't take away your ability to do so. It just says that you can't openly exhibit signs of your religious belief on the street, or no, thank you, or let it influence governmental policy. We think that that's a fair thing on either side. So when these migrants move to a country, it becomes a lot easier to integrate when, you're not expected to hide or be called out on what your beliefs are, because you know that no one else has any right to impose their beliefs on you either, and that the state, come it to, say, a legal case, has just as much of an obligation to treat your religion, no thank you, with as much distance as it does of any of the others. So just because we think that it's a lot easier to for migrants to integrate, for people to effect change for other minority groups which exist within and without the religious spheres, no thank you, we think that your entire speech doesn't work. Okay, so moving on to my speech, which is a long bit on Eunice's speech. Anyway, so firstly, we can't all opt in to just the good things of one religion, right? Yeah, you can opt in to Christmas, that's fine, but that's also opting in states like Saudi Arabia, where you have Muslim oil monarchies, into saying, persecuting people for not being of your religion is okay. No, thank you. We don't think that it's in any way feasible for us to just opt into good things of one religion because your state is, of that particular religion. We think it's incredibly harmful for all the minorities who can't opt into your religion because they're not of that state, but their beliefs aren't accounted for. We think that it's incredibly harmful to say me or my family because, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, just no. I think it's incredibly harmful to say people like me and my family who are Hindu, whose holidays aren't recognized by the state, whose holidays aren't recognized by things like state-funded colleges when you ask for leave off to go observe your holidays. So just because, no thank you, we can't opt into the same good things that you get out of your religion in a state, we think that it's a net harm to a lot more people. Okay, secondly, this idea, no thank you. No. I will ask if I want POIs. Anyway, so yeah. Secondly, on your speech, death is not God's realm. This idea that you think, when people die, we need a religious basis to channel our frustrations, or something we need to draw strength from. Death is not God's realm, and if anything, it's the state's obligation to equip its people with methods of self-reliance, with methods of being able to fortify their own mentalities, or their own improve their own mental health when in instances of great grief. And we don't think it's the state's obligation to then say, oh, go look at this religious text. It might not be, your religious text, but go look at this because, this will help you deal with things. We think that it's completely not the state's obligation to do that. And so we think anyway. So yeah, the majority of this is about how religion preaches divisiveness. Religion preaches divisiveness because, the something greater a state should choose to espouse is the loyalty of a citizen to its other living citizens and the loyalty of the citizen to the continuation of that state, because ultimately this is talking about states, not individual people. And you know, at the end of the day, if death is just the end for these people, we'd much rather they had like a net beneficial contribution to their society by, you know, treating everyone in the society as equals. Maybe, yeah, by treating everyone in their society as equals who undergo the same oppression of not being able to, you know, exhibit their religion openly, but treat them as equals in other ways which we just completely don't see in religious states. Case in point, at the moment, the increasing Hindu nationalism of India. Like, India evolved as a nation with a secular constitution. Yes, it evolved from like horrific, like the horrific atrocities of like the divisions of Pakistan and Bangladesh, but it emerged with a secular constitution, which allowed, you know, for the celebration of Christian festivals with Hindu festivals and Muslim festivals. Yes, it's a surprise anyone gets anything done in India, because most days of the week, most days of the year you have off. But like, the issues current, like increasing religious nationalism, is the fact that it's a religious nationalism. I found out today, to my surprise, that the BJP might well now be like the largest party in the world. When the largest party in the world openly like accepts like support from Hindutva, who are like the incredible like religious nationalists, when they actively oppress people from like eating beef and being Muslim or Christian, when they actively bring in prohibition laws in areas they have no right to meddle in, we think that's a net harm to like a lot of other parts of society who aren't getting their say just because like a current party happens to be ruling at the time, which we think is incredibly terrible. Okay, so finally, yeah, and like ultimately that brings me basically to this. Apparently in Eunice's world, religion is sacrosanct. It is unquestionable and immovable because it gives you your routine. Like, this narrative, even in Western liberal democracies, is more often than not established to not be offensive to the Judeo-Christian majority. Like, yeah, we get like this vague mention of like the burkini ban, but like we usually accept this routine as a Judeo-Christian routine, accepting Judeo-Christian holidays. Like, this is not about like a secular state accepting like all the members of that state. And until we go for radical secularism and push religion directly out of like the sphere of influence of like governmental policy, of how like governments are elected, out of legislature, how the police force works. Like, we are just not going to get this equality that they seem to espouse. And so, yeah, we think it's going to be a lot easier on like minority groups coming into a country. We think it's going to be a lot easier for minority groups who aren't like the primary religion of the state who live there. We think it's just better if like God doesn't decide where or what I do. So, thank you.
In world religions, not in theology, actually, just to kind of make that point. Like some of the speakers, I have something of a difficulty with kind of having any idea of what we mean by a radical secular state, because I think secularists generally don't tend to be all that radical. They pride themselves on their tolerance, etc. So I think it is a little bit kind of difficult to imagine what that might be. However, I think Eunice and other speakers have identified France as a somewhat problematic state in this regard, and one that certainly where questions are being asked in this regard. So perhaps I certainly will concentrate on France because it's this country I've studied and I have an interest in and have lived in and kind of have views upon. However, I think I would like to start really with just a couple of definitions. I know it's very pedantic, but I mean, we throw this word secularism, secularization, hypothesis, secularity around, and we're not always sure what it is exactly we mean. So the definition of secularization, the briefest definition, and in many ways the most useful, was given by Peter Berger, who said it is a process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and symbols. Fair enough. Brian Wilson brings it a little bit further when he talks about, interestingly, the radical reorganization of the structure of society, the process in which major areas of social organization become differentiated and autonomous, and in which organized religion has finally relinquished the last remnants of the presidency that had once enjoyed over a whole gamut of social affairs. It's quite a bit more developed. I think Ireland is an interesting example of a country that is advancing, perhaps belatedly, certainly, but certainly quite quickly along this trajectory. It is, however, difficult to see anything particularly radical in all of that. And indeed, I am sure the majority of you here this evening wouldn't really have any difficulty with it at all, even those who may themselves retain a strong sense of religious believing and belonging. In this sense, secularization is quite simply the corollary of socio-political modernity, where religious groups of all kinds find their place among the many other institutions that form a part of civil society and express their views. It is, in fact, quite widely accepted. Let me move on, though, to the term secularism, which is slightly different. While secularization can best be described as an evolutionary social process, secularism is more akin to a philosophical and indeed an intellectual position. It can be briefly defined as the positive belief that no interpretation of reality is accurate, and that no religious interpretation of reality is accurate, and that this task can only be taken on by what is often described as hard science. One does wonder what becomes then of the softer disciplines or sciences, for instance, art, literature, music, and even branches of a less positivistic philosophy. However, in the final analysis, this seems to be largely a question of opinion, often with quite intelligent, equally intelligent and rational people taking opposite views of the argument, despite some attempts to portray this otherwise. So equally rational people, if you like, believe and don't believe. So I don't think it's quite that easy. The Canadian philosopher of religion, Charles Taylor, reflects this very well when he notes that we have moved from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which it is understood to be one option amongst others, and frequently not the easiest to embrace. Belief in God is no longer axiomatic. There are alternatives, notably unbelief, and indeed it can credibly be argued that we have moved into a society where the presumption of belief has achieved hegemony. In certain crucial milieux, notably the one in which we are operating this evening, in other words, academia, but also in politics, in the media, and in the arts. The secularization hypothesis, which has been dominant in the sociology of religion since back to the 19th century positivist Auguste Comte, holds that the world, through a process of evolution, is moving inexorably in a secular direction from primitive societies with an understanding by magic, through developing societies whose understanding is dominated by religion, to modern societies which are ruled solely by science. Rodney Stark, the longtime professor of sociology and comparative religion at the University of Washington, writes, "At least since the Enlightenment, most Western intellectuals have anticipated the death of religion. Social scientists have particularly excelled in predicting the triumph of reason over superstition. The most illustrious figures in sociology, anthropology, and psychology have unanimously expressed confidence that their children, or surely their grandchildren, would live to see the dawn of a new era in which, to paraphrase Freud, the infantile illusions of religion would be outgrown. The West, and most notably Western Europe, where homo religiosus is fast becoming extinct, is widely seen to be somehow the pinnacle of this evolutionary trajectory." However, coming back to a very different Peter Berger from the one I quoted in my opening sentence, but still the same person, we find him writing more recently. "My point is that the assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. This means that a whole body of literature by historians and social scientists, loosely labeled secularization theory, is essentially mistaken. While I have little doubt that the process of secularization is indeed happening in many places around the world, including the Islamic world, I would stress, it is certainly true that for historical and other reasons, it is in Europe that it is most advanced, and the rest of the world is not necessarily following. The British sociologist of religion David Martin notes that up to now, proponents of universal secularization have seen all Catholic countries as prefigured by France, which you mentioned already, and all Protestant countries as prefigured by Sweden in terms of their trajectory in secularization. This, however, is where we run into something of a problem. Since it is a country that I have knowledge of and a great interest in, let me concentrate on France. Not because I believe it is, at this point, a radical secular state, but I do believe it to be a society where laïcité, which is really a very uniquely French word for secularism and has a different meaning, somewhat different meaning, which I don't really have time to go into here, has moved from being a social process with a positive socio-political value to the point where it risks becoming an ideology that will exclude and alienate a significant part of the population, with the risk of social tension, which is in fact already manifest. Somewhat ironically, given the historical insistence on laïcité, France is now the European country showing possibly the greatest signs of religious tension, notably with its Muslim community. And this has been underlined by other speakers. Reliable religious statistics are very difficult to determine, and particularly in France, where, precisely because of the emphasis on laïcité, the question of religious belonging does not even figure on the census form, because it is seen as something of an atteinte à la République. However, we do have some figures which give us a good idea of the situation. The CIA, always reliable, I think, its World Fact Book estimates that 5 to 10% of the French population is Muslim. Conrad Hackett of the very reliable Pew Research Center estimates that there are 4.7 million Muslims in France, in other words, 7.5% of the population, and that this would rise to 6.9 million, or 10.1% of the population in 2030. However, according to the French academic, and recently, Jean-Paul Gurevitch, who is something of a darling of the right wing in France, I gather just from my own research, there were 7.7 million Muslims at about 11% of the population in metropolitan France in 2011. Now, this certainly constitutes a question mark. What is clear is that France is engaged in what the political scientist and specialist on Islamic and contemporary Arab politics, Gilles Kepel, calls a war for Muslim minds. The focus of this effort is on the often alienated and hopeless youth of what have effectively become Muslim ghettos, where radical fundamentalism finds its most militant actors. Gurevitch estimates that there may be as many as 160,000 of these candidates for fundamentalist activities in France. I'm not sure how that stands, but that's the figure he gives. This is almost by definition a social powder keg, and it is certainly not a place to be throwing matches and inflaming passions. This is hardly the moment for what one secular Muslim intellectual describes as une querelle stupide, a silly argument really, on the choice of dress made by young Muslim women. A patronizing and pedantic French discourse on the virtues of what is perceived increasingly as an ideology of laïcité and symbolic confrontations on issues such as the hijab are not advancing matters at all. French scholars of radicalized Islam, such as Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy, are pointing to the central importance of Muslim youth in the hope that these European Muslims could present a new face of Islam reconciled with modernity to the larger world. This is surely desirable, but one has to ask how far we are getting in the real world. More recently, largely on the left, the concept of laïcité has been tacked on to what the British academic Hazir Singh describes as the French Revolutionaries' classic triad of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. And this, I think, cheapens it. I have no doubt that laïcité is a positive value, that it is one of the building blocks of social modernity. However, I don't think everybody is moving at quite the same pace, and I think it holds certain dangers, definite dangers, for a radicalized society in France.
I'd like now to call upon the second guest speaker, Mr. Michael Newton, who is the chairperson of Atheist Ireland.
Yeah, before I start, I think Patrick should retrospectively get his round of applause. So, I'd like to start by apologising. I think I've strayed into the wrong debating chamber. I thought we were debating the merits of radical secularism. It seems we're debating radical authoritarianism, an entirely different thing. If that was today's topic, I would be over on this side of the table. But it's not. The debate is not about authoritarianism. It's about secularism, which in political terms is, broadly speaking, political separation of religion and state. And secularism is not primarily about the decisions that governments make. It's about how governments make their decisions. It's about what's the most reliable way of coming up with decisions that are the best, fairest and most just for society. Do they rely on applying reason to the currently best available evidence, using evidence that is equally accessible to everybody who's involved in the decision-making process, or do they allow divine revelations or imagined divine revelations to influence the decisions? Revelations that give different and untestable messages to different people involved in the decision-making process. And I would ask you to imagine, if you will, a government coming to a decision on some issue of importance to its citizenry. And one member of the government produces a set of research documents that shows how this particular decision, when applied to another country, how it worked in practice. Somebody else appeals to human rights treaties that the government has signed up to and said we should base our decisions on these agreed principles that might include freedom of religion and belief, equality before the law, freedom from discrimination, basic principles like that. And then a third member says, well, I was talking to Napoleon Bonaparte in my sleep last night, and he told me that we should do this. Now, I presume you'd give less credibility to that intervention. And let's say another member says, well, I would disagree with the Napoleon Bonaparte suggestion because this morning over breakfast, Jesus appeared in my toast, and he gave me a message that was very similar to the message that he gave me the previous week when his mother appeared in a tree stump in Limerick. Now, all of these proposals you would immediately just ignore in proper government decision-making processes. But here's where it gets muddy. This is the kind of grey area. Is people will say, well, government decisions should be influenced by a religious belief because the creator of the universe wrote a book 2,000 years ago and we have to go along with the commands in that book. And then somebody else will go, no, actually the creator of the universe wrote a different book 1,300 years ago and we should obey the commands in that book. And here's the problem. Although we as a society, because of this kind of status quo of religion, tend to give more respectability to those beliefs, the Holy Book arguments are very much closer to the Napoleon Bonaparte told me or Jesus appeared in my toast processes of arguments than they are to arguments based on reason and evidence and applying reason to the currently best available evidence. And that is why we should support secular states. And if we apply that general principle to the question of secularism itself, and we ask on an evidence-based approach, why should we support secular states? Well, secularism it's a force for good. There's three basic ways philosophically that it's a force for good. It protects everybody's freedom of conscience and religion and belief. It enables people to believe whatever they want to believe. Secularism is not the same as promoting atheism. Secularists will be as opposed to the state supporting atheism as we are to the state promoting religion. The second is that secularism allows religious people to prepare in whatever way they want for the afterlife that they imagine they're going to go to, and it leaves the government able to focus on what happens in this life by applying reason to the best available evidence. And the third is that if you combine secularism with human rights standards, it's a foundation stone to build the type of secular democracies that are consistently the best in terms of social outcomes compared to either dictatorships of either secular or theocratic kinds or religious-based countries, and indeed religious-based states within the United States where they're broadly the same series of laws. The happiest countries are generally secular liberal democracies, which would include the Scandinavian countries, Northern European states. In general, secular states have lower rates of abortion, teenage pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, homicide, infant mortality rates, a whole range of problems that people traditionally assume that religion is good at solving those problems are at their least in secular democracies. There are studies, particularly by social scientist Phil Zuckerman and others, that show that atheists and secularists are generally less dogmatic, less authoritarian, less racist, less sexist, less dogmatic, more supportive of women's rights, more supportive of LGBT rights, more supportive of gender equality generally. These are consistent showings. I'll take the point when just come to the end of this particular section. These are consistently shown to be showing that in secular countries and in secular states within the United States, when compared to the Bible Belt states, that these social outcomes are better. And there is a group of scientists who do a thing called the World Values Survey, which you can look up on the internet, which is a team of interdisciplinary social scientists around the world who have been studying human values for the past few decades. And what they are showing is that there is a path to these secular rational values. And that path is when enough people move in a society away from survival values towards self-expression values, which is typically triggered by things like investment in health and education and communications technology, and moves towards democracy and perceived, if not necessarily real, control over your life. That when those things happen and sufficient people make that move from survival values towards self-expression values, that then brings society away from traditional religious values and towards secular rational values. And that is happening around the world at greater speeds in some places than others, but the world is becoming more secular. As a response to that, parts of the world are becoming more religiously fundamentalist, but the pattern is good in terms of secularism. I'll take that question now.
Just about the statistics you were saying, would that not be more to do with economics, those being Western countries than those being religious countries?
It's certainly to do with economic development. I mean, well, when I say it's certainly, we don't know exactly which is cause and which is effect. But whichever is the cause and effect, the correlation is that secular societies are better for people, whether it's caused by the economic movement or not. But it's the result of economic investment in things like health, education, communication technology seem to be key to it. But the upshot is the same. Secular societies are better for people than religious societies. In terms of France, the French cases and forcing women to wear certain clothes or not to wear certain clothes. I mean, obviously that's wrong. Secularism doesn't guarantee that you're going to get things right. You can have secular states that are socialist. You can have secular states that are capitalist. You can have secular states that are liberal. You can have secular states that are authoritarian. But radical secularism is about the separation of church and state. In terms of women being forced to wear things, and school children indeed in schools in terms of the veil, it depends on what the issue is. If you take human rights standards, the issue of schoolgirls not being allowed to wear veils went to the European Court of Human Rights, and that was found that it was justified because it was actually protecting the girls from being bullied. And with regards to the not allowing women wear things on the beach, I mean, obviously that's absurd, but that was overturned even within France, at court level. But the key thing I would ask people to remember there is, well, I strongly support the right of women to wear whatever that they want to wear, including burqas if they voluntarily want to wear it. We can't forget that we know that there are also women who are being forced to wear those against their will. And whatever mechanism is put in place has to try to protect both of those groups of people. Now, I'm going to finish by just reading briefly from a document called the Dublin Declaration on Secularism and Religion in Public Life. That was put together in 2011 by a group of international atheists and secularists that came to a conference that we in Atheist Ireland organised in Dublin called the World Atheist Conference. Now, if you want a definition of radical secularism by radical secularists, which is us, we're the people who actually spend our time campaigning for secularism rather than just looking at it as a random thing. I mean, this is our life. We are the radical secularists. This is the things we promote. Freedom of conscience, religion and belief are private and unlimited. Freedom to practice religion should be limited only by the need to respect the rights and freedom of others. All people should be free to participate in the democratic process. The sovereignty of the state is derived from the people and not from any god or gods. The state should be based on democracy, human rights and the rule of law. Public policy should be formed by applying reason and not religious faith to evidence. State education should be secular. Religious state-funded education, if it happens, should be limited to education about religion and its absence. Children should be taught about the diversity of religious and non-religious philosophical beliefs in an objective manner. There should be one secular law for all, democratically decided and evenly enforced, with no jurisdiction for religious courts to settle civil matters or family disputes. That's what radical secularism is from the point of view of those of us who campaign for radical secularism. And finally, I would just like you to notice that our opponents are, broadly speaking, using secular debating approaches to argue against secularism. They're not arguing that you should support the motion because Jesus appeared in their toast or because it's written in a holy book written 2,000 years ago. They're using broadly the type of arguments that should be used in secular decision-making because they know that you would ignore holy book arguments in this debating chamber. And if you wouldn't listen to holy book arguments in this debating chamber, then you shouldn't listen to them in our government. I urge you to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
Right, I'd like to call now upon Grace Conway.
This House regrets the rise of radical secularism, just as it regrets any overarching ideology being forced on populations by those who hold power. The expression of religious freedom has now become a liberty which must be granted by an authority. I think the argument on this motion is probably going to be that religion does more harm than good, which, to be honest, is a bit of a reductionist cop-out answer, because if you weigh up the checks and balances historically, that's probably just not true. On religion to them, the op is here tonight because of religion. What definitely does do more harm than good is religious separatism, or separatism in general, really, because it creates a distinct opposing groups within a society. People often prescribe a lot more to secularism than it is want. They see it as the tension forming between religion and the government as a dualism of two power structures, one claiming with no concrete evidence to be acting out on the authority of a deity, and the other claims as little evidence to be acting on behalf of its citizens. In essence, the secularist movement was inaugurated as a movement towards the separation of religion and government. But the reality is that the separation of church and state has led to an inherent bias against those who subscribe to religious. The movement of secularism often talks about religion like and recognizes there's inherent arrogance and a huge arrogance in radical secularism society, which sees itself as more evolved than religious-minded people. We think we outgrew it in the Enlightenment when we discovered our radical ideals of liberty and freedom and recognized the restraints and shackles of the church for what they really were. But not everyone was so lucky to escape that religious mindset. Not everyone learned to abandon religion during the Enlightenment. Some people clung to the belief out of insecurity and are clinging still. Hangovers from their early, more primitive and less intellectually developed history, and that is a horrifying idea. I don't regret the separation of church and state at all, but I do regret the arrogance and the attitude problem that went along with it, where rich heritage and belief systems are reduced to minimize the relevance of religion in the lives of its citizens. This movement doesn't define itself in terms of what it is, but what it isn't. It's a non-religious movement which has potential to stretch to an anti-religious movement, as it has arguably done in France. This complete rejection of religion and engagement with religion has led not to enlightenment, but going to lead to us growing intense fear of the religious other, which is threatening things like this, undoubtedly masking certain levels of Islamophobia within its culture, and is using its secular agenda to discriminate and alienate against its religious populations. It's clear in the language that they are using. Like, I was reading recently, doing a bit of research on this, in a ministerial circular, someone described like the wearing of the burqa, or the wearing of the hijab faith. Like, that's just horrible. A spokesman for the, like, I think that, but this is like the kind of the reaction to it, and it's huge discrimination, because a spokesman for the French Muslim group put it best when he was stating that there's a permanent demand for legislating against Muslims in France. And this is a demand that's just going to keep growing, and it keeps escalating, and it keeps, getting more and more, and people are reacting to it on both sides. And that's where the danger is when you push someone to a corner, the only thing left to do is react. Just like people reacted in the Enlightenment to religion, religious people are now going to start reacting to secularism in the same way. And this is hypocrisy in France, when clearly the values of liberty and fraternity, if you're a liberal middle-class atheist than if you believe in God. And that's just not fair. That's discrimination. It's not just France though, because if we look at China's state policy of irreligion, which has disastrous consequences for ethnic minorities, does anyone know how many Muslims there are in China? I do. It's a measly 1.6% of the population. But does anyone know how many people that actually is? Because in China, that is over 21 million people. There are 21 million Muslims in China, and you've probably not heard much of them until quite recently. Most of them are living in Xinjiang. This has been in the news a lot recently, which is an autonomous region where the government are restricting their heritage, they're restricting their tradition, they're restricting their unique ethnic identity as Uyghur people. And they're even, this extends to separate languages and things. No, thank you. And this is because of this separatism, it's leading to it's not allowing them to access education as easier as Han Chinese people. And they don't fit into this Chinese box, and they've never fit into this Chinese box, which, the Communist Party in China is trying to create. Their attachment to Islam as a part of their life and identity has caused them to be labelled as separatists. And this is very interesting, because the Chinese government started calling them separatists years ago. But the irony is that now the Chinese government crackdown and attempt to contain the Uyghur population in China has actually led to separatism. And this is the identity, that was given to themselves. If you start treating people like dissidents, they'll start acting like dissidents. So once again, we reach this familiar situation where the religious, non-religious binary has caused the ideology of secularism to be contrasted with Islamism. Two extremes in a polarized state create an even wider dichotomy between its citizens. Yes, they have succeeded in separating church and state, but what is the cost of doing that, actually, is the question we need to be asking ourselves. If the secular reforms are radical, expect the response of the religious minorities to be radical as well. I beg you to propose.
Right, I'd like to call now upon Mr. Ollie Donnelly.
Could I have a timer, please? My phone has died. Anyone? No? Yeah. Sorry. Everyone in this room will die. Before you do, I want to talk to you about three things. Conveniently, the first is death. Because in that moment, you're probably going to be very alone. There will be nothing, darkness. They can't prove there's a God, right? They have no way of arguing it, and they shouldn't put the burden upon us to argue that there isn't one. Much like if I say there's a cake in the ballot box, you're probably still going to assume there's not a cake in the ballot box, okay? So, is there a cake in the ballot box? No. Okay. So, taking that to be the case, right? And taking that no one in this room can prove that there's going to be anything else, what we say is you're born alone, you die alone, and you rot in the ground alone, okay? We say that in the absence of, by the way, even if there is a God, right, ultimately screw God, okay? Screw God for bone cancer in children, screw God for the people that say that the widespread creation of doctrines that have torn my hometown of Belfast apart over the years are a positive thing. Screw God for the disgusting bigots who would throw me off a building for loving who I love. Just ultimately, we do not care. What we say is that you probably serve no higher purpose. What we say is that your life is probably meaningless. And what we say is that that is why it is meaningful, ladies and gentlemen. We say that each happy moment, each coffee, each kiss, each brief break from the responsibilities of your life is important because it is something that you can seize upon and make yourself happy with. No thanks. We say that if you spend those moments serving some just stupid God that creates war, famine, disease, and death, you have wasted those moments, whether or not he exists, and he probably doesn't. So the second thing I want to talk about, no thanks, is ownership. Because your life can only be your own if you believe it's your own. Mr. Speaker, we say that slavery is a state of mind. We say that when you serve the purposes of some God, it is a kind of mental bondage that distracts you from the very least control that you can have in your life. We say that your soul should be your own. We say that it should not be something that is used to hold you to ransom from the moment you're born to the moment you die. We say that we're happy for people to decide to be religious, right? We say that you can wave your life away in that way if you want. But we say fundamentally that we don't think it's a decision when you are forced to pray in school, when you're raised to believe that God is watching you in each moment. We say that we don't think it is a decision when you are told by the people who teach you in life from the moment you're born that you are wrong to do the things you do, to love who you love, to think what you think, and when the other people around you are taught that same thing. We say that when you're born into a society with a religious bias, you're inherently raised in a society where you're taught that you have responsibilities that you do not and should not have, right? We say that that is a denial of ownership of yourself and of your own thoughts. And we say that no one should own your thoughts but you. No, we say that it is not right for the state then to mandate for these schools to exist, to mandate for religion to get a definition on laws, to define laws. We say that laws like the Eighth Amendment are disgusting but are hugely influenced by faith and by religion rather than any kind of reason. We say that the majority of people in Ireland probably want access to basic health care, given that the majority of people in Ireland are women, right? We say that it is then wrong to decide that the state should define these laws themselves. Finally, on responsibility. I think the responsibility of the state is to humanity, not to God. If God has a divergent opinion, I invite him to rebut me now. That silence says a lot about my case, okay? We say that the responsibility of the state is thus to the freedom of man. We say that this freedom involves protecting us from each other. And we say that when people are taught in school that women were created from man, for man, we say that that is wrong. We say that they fail to provide that freedom to women who are born into a society that tells them they are inferior. We say that when they are taught in schools that they will burn in hell for loving someone of the same gender or for being trans, we say that they are being denied the freedom to engage in their own identity. But we say it's an even deeper denial of freedom because they're being told that they are wrong from the very beginning. So that's why you shouldn't have faith schools, Mr. Speaker. But more broadly, right, we just think the state shouldn't endorse religion on a whole because we think it's something that fundamentally is entrapping in itself. We say that you should be protected from it for this reason, right? We say there should be no religious laws like the ones I've talked about that deny basic freedom. That would mean we wouldn't have to have referenda to decide who I can marry. That would mean we wouldn't have still need to have referenda to decide if women can have basic health care, which I think you probably want, right? Go.
Why are you assuming that abortion is just basic health care?
Fundamentally, I think it is the woman's own choice to be able to choose whether she wants to have this or not. I think this choice is something that the state should not mitigate out, particularly whenever the state does this on the basis of religious laws rather than a woman or an individual's free choice, okay? We think the state has a responsibility to protect rights that its relationship with religion would force it to deny. And we think on the basis of morals handed down by a possibly imaginary man in the sky is no basis at all. What I would say, is that when you go home tonight, I want you to just go home and do something that makes you happy. That basic happiness is why you should oppose this motion, ladies and gentlemen. And if God would object, well, I'll be damned.